What if the most important moment of your life happened in the middle of a rainstorm? Not a normal rainstorm. An acid rain storm on a planet that wanted you dead. And what if the only living thing that could save you was human? This is a story about a creature nobody wanted. A small, white, helpless hatchling abandoned in the worst storm of the century. Left to dissolve. Left to die. Left to disappear like it never existed. But something happened that nobody expected. One human mechanic heard something in the rain. Something small. Something crying. And everything changed. Today you are going to discover 3 things that will stay with you long after this video ends. You will discover why this albino hatchling was considered worthless by its own kind. You will discover what one ordinary human did that no one else dared to do. And you will discover why that single moment of courage rewrote the future of 2 very different species. No one saw this coming. Let me show you exactly how this happened. The rain started just before dawn. It always did on Werk 9. That is what the settlers called it. Werk 9, a gray industrial planet on the outer edge of the Cauldron system. It was not a beautiful place. It was not a friendly place. The sky was always the color of old metal. The buildings were always wet. The air always smelled like rust and chemicals. But people lived there. Humans mostly. Workers. Engineers. Mechanics. People who did not need beauty. People who just needed work. And work there was plenty of. The acid refineries ran 24 hours a day. Massive towers poured smoke into the sky every single hour of every single day. The ground around the refineries was scarred and black. Nothing grew there. Nothing natural anyway. The acid rain was a side effect of all that industry. When the clouds gathered over the refinery district, everyone knew what was coming. Alarms would sound. Workers would run inside. Doors would slam shut. Windows would be sealed. Everyone knew the rules on Werk 9. You do not stand in the acid rain. Not even for a second. Because it burns. Not fast. Not like fire. Slow. Like a whisper that turns into a scream. It eats through fabric first. Then skinches. Then everything else. Most people on Werk 9 had scars somewhere on their hands or neck from being caught outside just a few seconds too long. Old-timers called those scars their rain tattoos. They wore them like badges. But on this particular morning, nobody was thinking about rain tattoos. They were thinking about getting inside. Marcus Hale was already late. He was always late. His supervisor called it a personality defect. Marcus called it a sleep disorder. Either way, he was running across the maintenance yard when the first drops started falling from the sky. He felt one hit the back of his hand. It stung immediately. He swore under his breath, pulled his jacket tighter, and ran faster toward the equipment bay. The big metal doors were already sliding shut. 2 other workers were squeezing through the last few feet of the opening. Marcus dove through just in time. The doors shut behind him with a heavy metallic boom. He stood there breathing hard, shaking the rain off his jacket sleeve. A small smoking hole had already formed where the drop had landed on the fabric. He stared at it for a second and exhaled slowly. Close. The equipment bay was loud and warm. Big industrial lights buzzed overhead. The smell of machine oil and metal was everywhere. About 30 workers were crowded inside, some still catching their breath, some already back to work on the various engines and vehicles lined up in rows across the floor. Marcus pulled off his wet jacket and hung it on a hook near the door. He grabbed his tool belt from his locker, strapped it on, and headed toward Bay 7, where a busted atmospheric compressor had been waiting for his attention since yesterday. That is when he heard it. He stopped walking. He tilted his head. The sound of the rain on the metal roof was loud, a constant roaring hiss that filled the whole building. But underneath that sound, underneath all that noise, there was something else. Something small. Something that did not belong. He stood completely still and listened harder. There it was again. A cry. Not a human cry. Not a machine sound. Not a pipe rattling or a valve leaking. It was softer than all of those things. Weaker. More desperate. It was coming from outside. Marcus turned slowly and looked back at the sealed doors behind him. The acid rain was hammering against the other side of those doors right now. He could hear it. That furious chemical hiss that ate through metal if you left it long enough. Nothing survived out there during a storm. Nothing. He told himself he had imagined it. He took one step toward Bay 7. And then he heard it again. Marcus did not move for a full 10 seconds. He just stood there in the middle of the equipment bay with 30 other workers all around him, and listened to that sound coming from outside the sealed doors. It came again. Quiet, weak, trembling, like something very small was running out of time. He turned around and walked back toward the doors. He pressed the side of his head against the cold metal and listened as closely as he possibly could. The acid rain roared on the other side, like static on a broken radio. But underneath it, beneath all that chemical fury, the sound was still there. Small, desperate, alive. Marcus pulled back from the door and looked around the bay. Nobody else had noticed. Everyone was busy. Heads down, tools out, doing what they were paid to do on Werk 9. Survive and work. Work and survive. He walked over to the side cabinet near the door and pulled out the emergency rain gear. A full-coverage suit designed for quick trips outside during light acid events. Thick polymer coating. Sealed seams. Full hood with visor. The kind of suit that was rated for about 90 seconds in moderate rain before the coating started to degrade. The rain outside right now was not moderate. He knew that. He put the suit on anyway. His colleague Den looked up from under the hood of a transport crawler and immediately frowned. "What are you doing?" "Thought I heard something outside." Den stared at him like he had just said something in a foreign language. "In the rain?" "Yeah." "Marcus." "I know. You know the suit rating in heavy acid is like a minute tops, right? 63 seconds actually. I checked the label." Den put down his wrench slowly. "You are going outside in a heavy acid storm for 63 seconds because you thought you heard something. Something alive." Den opened his mouth, then closed it, then shook his head and picked his wrench back up. "You are absolutely insane," he said quietly. Marcus sealed the hood visor, walked to the emergency side panel next to the main doors, and hit the manual release for the small service hatch. It was a hatch just big enough for one person to squeeze through, used for emergency sensor checks during storms. The hatch cracked open. The sound of the acid rain hit him like a wall, loud and angry and chemical. The smell even through the sealed visor was sharp and industrial. His suit immediately began to beat up as the rain hit it. He could see tiny wisps of vapor rising where the drops landed. He squeezed through the hatch and stepped outside. The storm was worse than he expected. The maintenance yard was already flooded with shallow pools of acidic water. The ground steamed everywhere. The sky above was a deep churning gray, with yellow-tinged clouds rolling fast overhead. Every surface in the yard was slick and glowing faintly with that horrible wet chemical sheen. Marcus scanned the yard quickly. He had maybe 50 seconds left on the suit before the coating started breaking down. He saw nothing. He started to think Den was right. He started to think he really had lost his mind. He started to turn back toward the hatch. And then he saw it. In the corner of the yard, pressed up against the base of the outer wall, underneath a tiny ledge of overhanging metal that was providing barely any shelter at all. Something white. Something small. Something curled up and shaking and soaking wet and barely moving. Marcus ran. His boots splashed through the steaming pools. The rain hammered his suit. He could feel it now through the coating. Just barely. Just a whisper of heat on his shoulders and the back of his hands. The suit was starting to go. He did not slow down. He reached the corner of the wall, dropped to one knee in the steaming water, and looked at what was huddled there beneath that tiny ledge. His breath caught in his chest. It was a hatchling. An albino dragon hatchling. Pure white scales. Wings barely formed. Body no bigger than both his fists put together. And the largest, most vivid green eyes he had ever seen in his entire life, staring up at him from the ground. Those eyes were full of tears. Marcus had seen a lot of things in his 12 years on Werk 9. He had seen industrial accidents that turned grown men pale. He had seen creatures from a dozen different worlds pass through the refinery district. He had seen things that kept him awake at night, and things he wished he could forget entirely. He had never seen anything like this. The hatchling was barely conscious. Its white scales had already taken damage from the acid rain. Small pockmarks across its back and the tops of its wings, where the rain had found it before it crawled under that ledge. The tiny wings were folded tight against its body. Its breathing was shallow. Every breath came out as a small trembling wheeze. But those eyes, those enormous green eyes were still open, still watching him, still holding on. Marcus looked at his suit. He could see the coating on his left shoulder was already pitting. A thin line of vapor rising from the sleeve cuff. He had maybe 20 seconds left before the acid started finding skinches. He reached forward with both hands, as gently as he could, and carefully scooped the hatchling up from the steaming ground. The creature flinched, then went still. It looked up at him. Marcus tucked it against his chest, stood up, and ran. He hit the service hatch at full speed, squeezed through, and pulled it shut behind him. The hatch sealed with a pressurized click. He stood in the bay, gasping for breath. The hatchling pressed carefully against his chest with one hand. The entire equipment bay went silent. 30 workers stared at him. Den had stood up from the crawler. He was staring too, wrench still in his hand, mouth open. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Marcus carefully opened his jacket and looked down at the hatchling nestled against his chest. It was shaking badly. Its small body was cold and wet and trembling continuously. The damage on its scales looked worse in the light. Several patches on its back were raw and weeping. But the green eyes were still open, still watching him. "What is that?" someone said from across the bay. "Dragon hatchling," Marcus said quietly. "Albino." A murmur moved through the crowd. Everyone on Werk 9 knew about the dragon colonies. The native Werk dragons had lived in the deep canyon systems on the far side of the planet long before humans ever arrived. They were not aggressive toward humans. They were not friendly either. They mostly kept to themselves. They were also known for something else. They abandoned their albino young. It was not cruelty exactly, at least not in the way humans understood cruelty. Albino hatchlings were considered a bad omen in Werk dragon culture. Sources within the xenobiology research teams on the planet reportedly suggested that albino hatchlings had historically been associated with colony sickness and bad seasons. The instinct to abandon them had been hardwired into the species over thousands of years. The colony had not wanted this one. They had left it outside the refinery district when the storm began. They had left it there to die. Marcus looked down at the small, shaking creature in his hands and felt something settle hard and quiet in his chest. He unzipped his work locker, pulled out his spare thermal jacket, and carefully wrapped the hatchling inside it. He sat down on the floor of the bay with his back against the lockers and held the bundle close to his body, sharing his warmth. Den walked over slowly and crouched down beside him. He looked at the small white face peeking out from the folds of the thermal jacket. Those enormous green eyes blinking slowly. The shallow breathing starting to even out just slightly from the warmth. Den was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very softly, "What are you going to do with it?" Marcus thought about it. Outside, the acid rain kept hammering the roof. "Keep it warm," he said. "Figure the rest out later." The storm lasted 6 more hours. Marcus did not move from that spot on the floor for most of it. He sat with his back against the lockers and the hatchling wrapped in his thermal jacket, and he just stayed still. Kept warm, kept breathing slow so the creature against his chest would feel the rhythm and calm down. It worked. Somewhere around the 2nd hour, the trembling stopped. Around the 3rd hour, the breathing evened out into something that actually sounded like sleep. By the 4th hour, the little white head was tucked completely under the fold of the jacket, and the green eyes were closed. Other workers came and went. Some of them stopped to look. A few of them asked questions. Most of them shook their heads and went back to work. On Werk 9, you learned quickly not to get attached to things. The planet had a way of taking things from you. Getting attached only made it worse. Den brought Marcus a cup of protein broth from the break room and set it on the floor next to him without saying anything. Marcus nodded. Den nodded back. That was enough. When the storm ended, the alarms sounded the all clear. Workers started opening the main doors. Fresh air poured in, still sharp and slightly chemical, but nowhere near as dangerous as during the storm itself. The flooded yard outside steamed slowly in the gray post-storm light. Marcus carefully unwrapped the hatchling from the jacket. It was awake immediately. Those green eyes snapped open and looked directly at him, alert and focused in a way that seemed almost too intelligent for something this young and this small. The albino scales had dried during the hours against his warmth, and they glimmered in the bay lighting with a faint pearlescent shimmer. Even the damage patches on its back looked slightly less raw. It was looking at him like it was waiting for him to do something. Marcus stood up slowly, keeping the hatchling cradled in both hands. The real problem was now obvious. He could not keep it in the equipment bay. His supervisor would have it removed by end of shift. He could not take it to the colony. They had already made their decision about this hatchling before the storm even started. He could not release it outside alone. It was too young, too damaged, too small to survive on Werk 9 without protection. He knew all of this. He also knew something else. He had no idea how to raise a dragon hatchling. He had no materials, no habitat, no specialized food source, no training, nothing that the xenobiology manuals would consider remotely acceptable for the care of a young Werk dragon. What he had was a small apartment in the worker residential block. A single room with a cot, a wall heater, a small food unit, and a window that looked out over the refinery towers. He looked down at the hatchling. The hatchling looked back up at him. It made a sound. Not the desperate crying sound he had heard from outside in the rain. Something different. Quieter. Almost questioning. Like it was asking him something in a language he had not learned yet. Marcus exhaled. "Okay," he said quietly. "Come on then." He tucked it carefully under his arm, grabbed his jacket from the hook, and walked out of the equipment bay into the post-storm gray morning of Werk 9. Nobody stopped him. Nobody said anything. Only Den watched him walk across the yard toward the residential block. And Den, who had been on this planet long enough to know better than to get attached to anything, felt something strange happen in his chest as he watched Marcus walk away with that small white shape tucked under his arm. He stood at the bay doors for a long moment after Marcus disappeared around the corner. Then he went back inside, picked up his wrench, and got back to work. But for the rest of that day, he kept thinking about those green eyes. 3 months passed. Marcus named the hatchling Ash. He was not sure why. It just seemed right. Something about the way the gray Verk 9 light hit those white scales in the morning and turned them the color of pale ash. Something about finding life in the middle of a storm that turned everything around it to ash and ruin. Ash grew fast, faster than Marcus had expected. Within the first month, the hatchling had doubled in size. By the second month, the wings had filled in properly. Strong membranes stretched between elegant curved bones. The acid damage on its back had healed almost completely. New scales had grown over the damaged patches, slightly different from the rest. A faint silver instead of pure white, like scars that had turned beautiful. Marcus learned quickly. He read every xenobiology report he could find on Verk dragons. He contacted 2 researchers at the Cauldra System Science Outpost and explained his situation. According to the researchers he spoke with, bonded albino hatchling raised by a NON colony caregiver was reportedly extremely rare, possibly unprecedented in the documented history of the species on Verk 9. They wanted to study Ash. Marcus said no. He was not interested in Ash becoming a research subject. He was interested in Ash becoming healthy and strong and eventually free. That had always been the plan. He told himself that from the very beginning. Keep it warm, get it healthy, release it when it was strong enough to survive on its own. Simple, clean, no attachment. He had been lying to himself, and he knew it. On a quiet Tuesday morning in the 3rd month, Marcus was sitting on the floor of his apartment eating breakfast when Ash climbed up onto his shoulder, folded both wings carefully, and went to sleep pressed against the side of his neck. The warmth of the small body against his skinches. The soft rhythm of that breathing. Marcus sat completely still for a very long time. He did not eat his breakfast. He did not move. He sat there in the gray morning light of Verk 9 with a sleeping albino dragon on his shoulder and felt something in him that he had not felt in 12 years on this hard gray planet. He felt like he was home. The story might have ended there. A quiet moment. A small victory. One creature saved. One man healed by the saving of it. But Verk 9 was not a planet that let things stay quiet. The Verk dragon colony sent a representative 3 weeks later. This had never happened before. Colonies did not interact with human workers. Researchers had studied them from a distance for years. Direct colony contact with humans was considered essentially impossible based on everything the science teams had documented. But one morning, an elder dragon arrived at the edge of the residential block. Massive, ancient, scales the deep gray-green of old canyon stone. It stood at the edge of the worker district, and it waited. Marcus was told about it by 3 different people before he went outside to see for himself. He brought Ash. The elder dragon looked at Ash for a long time. It looked at Marcus for a long time after that. Then it did something that the 2 xenobiology researchers Marcus had spoken with would later describe as completely unprecedented in all documented records of Verk dragon behavior. It bowed its head. Not to Ash. To Marcus. Nobody fully understood what that meant. The researchers had theories. The workers in the residential block had rumors. Marcus himself never claimed to understand it completely. What he knew was this. 3 days after that meeting, the elder dragon returned. This time it brought others. And in the weeks and months that followed, something began to form between the human worker settlement and the Verk dragon colony. Slow, careful, built on no words at all. Built entirely on what had happened in an acid rainstorm on a gray Tuesday morning, when one ordinary man heard something crying and decided not to keep walking. It was never the big moments that changed history. It was the small ones. It was always the small ones. Here is what nobody talks about. Marcus Hale was not a hero before that morning. He was late to work. He was tired. He had a busted compressor waiting in Bay 7 and a supervisor who already thought he was a problem. He was completely ordinary. And that is exactly the point. The most important thing this story asks is not whether humans are brave or strong or special. It asks something much simpler. It asks whether you will stop walking when you hear something crying in the rain. Whether you will put on a compromised suit and run toward the thing everyone else has left behind. Whether you will keep it warm and figure the rest out later. The future of two species on Verk 9 did not begin with a grand gesture. It began with 63 seconds of courage from someone who almost kept walking. If this opened your eyes, the next story will take you even deeper. Let's bring it all together. One abandoned albino hatchling, left to die in acid rain by its own colony, found by one ordinary human mechanic who had no reason to stop and every reason to keep walking. That single act of compassion did not just save one creature. It cracked open something between two species that had never spoken. It built a bridge out of nothing but warmth and 63 seconds of courage. And it started because one man listened when everyone else had already sealed the doors. If this story hit something in you, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear stories like this one. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new HFY story. New uploads happen every week, and each one is built to pull you completely into another world. Here is your question for today. Drop it in the comments below. If you were Marcus standing at that service hatch with a compromised suit and 60 seconds left, would you have gone outside? Tell me honestly. And when you are ready for the next story, it is already waiting for you on screen right now. See you there.